All right. Welcome back to another episode of the Qualtrics XM Community Podcast. I'm Michael Cooksey, and I'm the head of XM Community at Qualtrics. And we are very, very excited today to have Adam Korengold as our featured guest. Adam is an expert in all things data collection and visualization. And Adam, we're super excited to have you as our guest today. Would you like to introduce yourself for our listeners?
Sure, Michael, and I'm really happy to be here. Thanks so much for including me. I'm a big fan of the Qualtrics community, and it's been really helpful for me and my team as CX practitioners just to have this resource. So thanks for having me. I'm the analytics lead at the National Library of Medicine, which is one of 27 institutes at the National Institutes of Health in Bethesda, Maryland. So as you could imagine, we've kind of been at the forefront of everything going on medically over the last 3 years. So, of course, just coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic, this has been a really interesting time to be working at one of the world's and the nation's preeminent medical libraries. So we've learned a lot about what our customers are looking for. Just by way of introduction, I grew up in Washington, D.C. I've gone away to college and graduate school a little bit, but I've always been kind of based here in DC. I'm a contractor with NLM, so the first thing I'll say here is all of the opinions that I'm stating here are mine only, and they don't reflect the opinions of my contractor or NLM. In addition to what I do at NLM, I also teach in the Graduate Data Analytics and Visualization program at the Maryland Institute College of Art, which is one of the oldest art schools in the country, but they have a really rich data analytics and viz program for master's candidates. So I teach sort of the pre-capstone course on data visualization. So one of the things I like to talk about is how I view my role as bringing all of those things together. So we certainly focus on CX research on my team, but I often see visualization as both kind of the first 10 feet of analytics, in the sense that you use it for exploratory research, but I also see it as kind of the last 10 feet or the last mile as well, because if we don't visualize what we found, then our data and our insights don't have the impact that they could otherwise have. So again, Michael, thanks so much for having me here today, and I'm really excited for our conversation.
Absolutely. Well, I'm very excited to talk with you again today, and we appreciate that you are such a good friend to the XM community, and we're very excited that you're taking part in our new podcast initiative. For anybody who's listening, the XM Community Podcast series is a new initiative we're launching. We'll be featuring customer spotlights, community member spotlights, such as this one, and we'll also be talking with Qualtrics leaders as well throughout this series. So thank you very much, Adam, for being one of our first guests.
Sure thing. Happy to be a guinea pig.
Well, let's talk about data visualization. I know this is something that you're extremely passionate about, and I know that you are an expert in your field when it comes to this topic. There's so much to unpack when it comes to data visualization. One of the things that you and I touched on recently is this topic of accessibility of data and the various meanings that can take, and the various layers that are involved within any definition of accessibility when it comes to data visualization. Why don't we start there today and talk a little bit about that topic?
Sure. And I think that's a really good place to start, because one of the things that I try to be as aware of as I can be is that we don't necessarily control who sees what we do. And when I'm running analytics, say at NLM for my colleagues and our leadership, typically that stays within NLM. So I think we have a lot of control over those conversations that we have, and when we're, let's say, saying, we ran, let's say, a customer oriented experiment, or we tried to run some data, we took a survey. We were far enough up the learning curve on that discussion that we kind of know who's going to be seeing it and whom it's going to get in front of. But certainly as that starts to spread through the organization, we're going to be getting in front of leadership more, and people who probably have a little less time to invest either in reviewing what we've done or in learning what it means, learning what our methodology is. So the things that we create, and I'm not just talking about the analytics here, I'm talking about how do we actually put them on a screen or on a page, and how do we make them resonate?
Yeah.
So that's kind of the small order impact that we have around accessibility and usability. But then more broadly in the area of data visualization, and I think increasingly federal agencies and places like NLM are going to be doing more what I would call thought leadership, which is that the information that we're producing is going to go beyond our four walls. It's going to go through social media platforms. It's going to be published in different places. People are going to use it on their blogs. So the information that we produce needs to be accessible in a lot of different ways. And I'll now go into kind of what I mean by accessibility, and I'll unpack that a little bit. So in the federal government, when we think about accessibility, I think what comes to mind for most people is Section 508 compliance. And that means Section 508 of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which basically has to do with compatibility with screen readers. So if we're putting a chart in a report or on a website, we need screen readers to be able to read that correctly. And of course, one of the advantages of data visualization is that, you might be taking what you'd otherwise be putting on a really complicated spreadsheet and rendering it in a really interesting visual way. But screen readers often have difficulty with that. They don't like matrices. And when we write surveys and we're trying to deploy surveys, we'll use the accessibility tool, say on Qualtrics or whatever else people are using to evaluate those questions. And screen readers don't like matrix questions. They don't like some of the other more elaborate question types that you might see on different survey tools. So, the first part of it is, how do you provide information in a way that's compatible with screen readers? But not everyone needs a screen reader. Some people have low vision, some people are colorblind. And so that creates a whole set of other issues with accessibility, like color palettes. So on the one hand, often kind of a traffic light methodology will work for colors because green means go, that things are, the way you want them to be. That's kind of a positive color. Red kind of connotes danger, either don't do this, or on a map, this might be a place that is of concern. Yellow means neutral, but for colorblind people, it's hard to distinguish between reds and greens. So we want to avoid that palette. The other thing that we run into sometimes is reds and blues can have a political connotation that we may not want to put into the discussion, or that we may not want to assume. In a lot of my Thank you. And in a lot of my baseball research, which I do, I tend to use reds and blues because it tends to not be political. But that's not necessarily true for my students. That's not necessarily true for some of the potential visualizations that we could do in NIH, because, we want to stay apolitical. And there's some other thoughts on colors that for neurodivergent audiences, we want to avoid kind of high stress, really loud colors that tend to, create a lot of confusion. And then another issue with accessibility is this difference between, or the kind of the trade-offs between complexity and simplicity. That on the one hand, we can create this really complex, multi-layered visualization that lets us show the relationship between a lot of different parameters. And so when we're doing CX research, say, that lets us layer different segments over each other, or if we're combining our Qualtrics, our CX data with operational data, OX data, and we want to be able to segment by geography, by type of respondent, by income level if we have access to that information, and so on, or channel or device type. That's a lot of layers to put into a single visualization. And on the one hand, it's nice to be able to put all of that onto a single chart that's interactive and that people can kind of go at their own pace through. But on the other hand, that's a lot to ask cognitively.
Yes.
Sometimes.
Yes.
And, especially when you've got a senior leadership audience that has, let's say they have 5 minutes to walk through your deck, or you have 5 minutes with them.
Right.
If you present that kind of chart to them, let's say in a 10-minute presentation, you might take up 8 minutes of that 10 minutes just explaining how to use the visualization. So things that are simpler tend to be better.
Yes.
So those are some of the trade-offs around accessibility, some of which are kind of related specifically to accessibility, and some that we think of as we're asking, well, what's the best way to provide this information? We've already done a good job collecting it. We've put together a good survey. We've collected good information, but now how do we want to show this in a way that's going to have the impact that we want it to have?
Right. That last point in particular is interesting to me too. And I've been in that position before many times where, okay, you've got 10 minutes or less to explain what you're trying to convey to the leadership team or to your audience. And that topic of accessibility in terms of ease of digestion or ease of comprehension is really important to me. But we also want the data to be not just easy to understand, but also impactful, and perhaps in some cases propel us or inspire us to change. And I catch myself when I see interesting analytics being presented on various platforms, whether it's social media or professional networking platforms. Good data visualization is something that really grabs my attention and also inspires me. And I see that a lot around not just necessarily industry topics, but social or geopolitical topics as well. And so I'm wondering if we can dive into a little bit the topic of data visualization that perhaps inspires positive change. Or it's about, like I mentioned before, a geopolitical issue or any other subject. I think that there's a lot of potential in that area to spur positive change.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, Michael, and it's one actually that I think about a lot, and I'm really inspired when Micah keeps getting groups of students that know the power of data visualization to promote change or to promote just awareness of different topics. And the notion, the old adage that a picture is worth 1,000 words really applies here, because being able to see something manifest in an image, or even better, an image that you can interact with and work with and kind of see for yourself, has potentially a lot more impact than a white paper or a news report or a political speech. The thing that, and we were just talking about this in my class last week, that if you have, say, a piece of data that, and again, I'm just picking something out of the top of a hat here, but it might have been from something that I did read. But if you read, let's say, a white paper which says that 1 out of every 7 high school students um, reports having used some kind of vaping device, right? And we know that there are a lot of potential health issues around e-cigarettes.
Correct.
We know that they're popular among certain age groups and certain people. So hearing that statistic, 1 out of 7 has a lot of resonance. And, we can think, well, do you know 7 high school students? Then one of them is probably vaping. But if you can show a story, or if your high school age child comes to you and says, I have 3 friends, everybody I know vapes, and I have 3 friends who had to be hospitalized because of something related to their use of e-cigarettes, that creates a lot of immediacy and a lot of concern around that topic. And visuals are the same way, because they let us show something on a screen or on a piece of paper that ideally is easy to navigate through, but it's visual. And we tend to be visual creatures. Our culture is very visual. So we've adapted to recognize things that are shown in that way, to see pie charts and line charts to show progress in something over time or change in something over time. I remember going back to my old communications classes in college, there was this idea that if you see words on a screen, you tend to read them. And of course, this was almost 30 years ago. So, think of how much we've evolved since then, where, yes, if you see words on a page, you tend to read them. But if you see visuals on a page or on a screen, you tend to react to them very differently than if you're just reading a piece of text. And the other power that visualization has is to create stories, to create narrative in a different way. So if you see a sequence of different visualizations in, let's say, in a PowerPoint chart, that can be really effective, because you can create a sequence and you can frame it in ways that make sense for the information. So, for example, starting from a really, really broad area of focus and then narrowing down, or you can even use Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, as an approach where, here's the introduction to the topic, here's the problem that we started out valiantly trying to solve, and here's our helper that came along the way. And I won't get into the hero cycle, but you can kind of see where I'm going with that.
Yeah. I'm curious to know, you just mentioned how things have evolved over time in the course of data visualization and best practices. One thing that I think about a lot when I'm putting together data myself or collecting data is just the audience's attention spans. And I feel like, and I'm just presenting this anecdotally from my own experience, I feel like as professionals, as a society, globally, I feel like our attention spans have decreased because of the amount of information that's coming at us all the time, and the way information is coming into our worlds through different platforms. And so I think because of that, or at least in my experience, I think because of that, it seems like attention spans have become shorter. And so that means for somebody who's trying to present data in a compelling way, that's something you probably have to take into account, is how long are they going to take to evaluate this piece of data in front of them, whether it's on a slide or on another platform. How do you think about that? This concept of perhaps decreased attention spans because of I'll say information overload that we deal with in our society.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's a factor of a lot of things. And we could have a whole series of podcasts, based on shorter attention spans, I think, to begin with. But I think it's a really important thing to keep in mind, and that attention spans aren't just limited by the amount of time that people have, but also the awareness or exposure or the lack thereof that they have to our methods
Mhm.
as researchers. And if anything, that's something that I'm even more aware of, because when I present to people generally in my work, whether it's at NLM or if it's in my teaching, or I think I mentioned earlier that I'm a member of the Society for American Baseball Research, so I've done some visualization work there as well. And when you're presenting to these kinds of groups, they tend to be pretty comfortable with numbers. Um, and in many cases, but not all, they tend to be pretty comfortable with statistics, but not always.
Mhm.
So the methods that we tend to use as researchers, where we might compare one segment to another and say, well, these results are statistically significant to the 0.001 confidence level, the 99% confidence level. And you say that, and it resonates immediately because people understand what that means. But if I'm presenting to a more general audience, or to even people in leadership who maybe took statistics for one semester in college and they don't really remember a lot of it,
Right.
or there are also a lot of people that I've worked with. In fact, one of my earlier jobs was with I worked with medical salespeople, and I also worked with public affairs executives. And
Mhm.
something I would hear a lot in those communities is, I went to college and studied the things that I wanted to study because I didn't want to take a math class,
Right.
right? So there's a limited attention span, especially when it's a very complex and unfamiliar topic. So one of the things that we need to do as visualizers is to kind of define our terms, define our assumptions in a way that our audience is going to be able to get their head around,
Yeah.
and in a way that's not talking down to them, but in a way that really plays to kind of what their concerns are going to be. So if I'm presenting, say, statistical findings, I'll say, well, I ran some statistical tests on this, and I found that the differences I'm going to talk about here are real differences, that it's not just that, we got lucky because we picked the right data. It's that these actually seem to be relevant statistically. And if you want more detail about that, I can give it to you.
Right.
That can go in the appendix of the presentation, or if they want to talk to me afterwards, they can ping me and I can show them the numbers. So that's a way that I think addresses kind of that limited attention span,
Mhm.
that desire to kind of understand things readily. People don't want to have to leaf through their old statistics textbook from
Right.
college 20 years ago to understand what I'm talking about.
Correct. Yeah, that's true.
So, I've learned, I think I've learned better how to navigate through that over time also.
It sounds like it. It sounds like it. I think
Mhm.
that your approach is spot on, is giving people, um, telling people the data story in a compelling way, and then also giving them, whether it's in the appendix of a presentation or as a follow-up uh, meeting, deeper information for those who want to go deeper or really get their
Mhm.
hands dirty with the data.
Mhm. Yeah.
I think as a last topic, I'm going to throw you a choose your own adventure question. So
Okay.
you can
I
you
like
can
that.
choose either of these, or if you feel like it's too difficult to choose
Mhm.
between them, you can speak to both if you want to. One is for people who are starting out in exploring different ways of creating compelling data visualization. What are some resources or areas you would recommend for them to start with? And then
Mhm.
the other question that I'm curious to know more about is where do you see data visualization going in the next decade?
Okay. I think those are both good questions, and I'll take them in turn if that's okay.
Yeah, of
So
course, of
I'm
course.
choosing both adventures, I guess.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah. So where to start? And I think that's a really good question because there's there's a growing number of opportunities to take some really good coursework in data analytics and visualization. And I'm not here to plug or endorse anything.
of course.
If you want to take a look, whether it's the MICA program, or I think Boston University has a good one, there are a lot of places to get exposure to um, good data viz tools, and to kind of build a toolbox, both of the actual things that you would do data viz in, like Tableau or Power BI, the types of analytics that you can do, which include things like R programming, SQL, querying, and things like that. And that's not really what I'm about. What I'm more about is the actual practice of visualizing that you can do with a pen and paper as well. You don't need all these fancy technical tools to do it. And as far as resources to start with, the Data Visualization Society is a really good one. I think you can Google them, but I think it's datavizsociety.org. They're a volunteer organization that's global. They also run some annual conferences and local meetups. They have both a print and virtual magazine called Nightingale, as in Florence Nightingale. And it's really a good resource to see what people are doing, what kinds of visualizations are being produced, what some challenges particularly might be. You can also go onto Tableau Public, which is the free version of Tableau, where you can have a profile to both collect other people's visualizations and see what people are doing, and also to upload your own. And I think what all of this is getting at is that the best way to kind of get started with visualizing data is to visualize data, and to find out, how do you operate in this area? What do you like to create? Because it's so visual, it's a very creative medium.
Yeah, absolutely.
I've even done data viz paintings
Yes.
of based on baseball, based on other attributes. I have one here of Russian poets from kind of my earlier academic
Yes.
life, and
I think
that's a really
that I-
time-honored tradition too. Yeah, so some of the things that you can, sorry, I just lost my train of thought for a moment. Um, it's really a matter of just getting started,
Yeah.
and finding topics that really interest you, whether they're professional topics or personal topics, and just putting ideas to paper and getting them out there. Some other resources to consult. There's some really good writers on data visualization. One is Edward Tufte, whom people have very strong opinions about
Okay.
typically, but his books and his online courses are widely available. David Dykes is another, or Brent Dykes, sorry, is another very, very good one on data visualization and storytelling. And I'd really be leaving something out if I didn't plug W.E.B. Du Bois's data portraits. W.E.B. Du Bois was the first Black recipient of a doctorate from Harvard University. And he was one of the most brilliant people that this country's ever produced.
Yeah.
He was a sociologist by trade, but he was also a political activist, a science fiction writer, and probably a million other things that I'm leaving out here. And for the 1901 World Exposition in Paris, he created this set of data visualizations with a team of his students that were, again, this predated Tableau. So all of them were hand-drawn, hand-inked, and they basically sat on a shelf at the Library of Congress until 2013, when someone found them again and digitized them. They are gorgeous.
Yes.
And they're a portrait of of Black America 35 years after the end of the Civil War. So, and just an incredible historical artifact, and aesthetically beautiful as well. So definitely worth a look and very inspiring as well.
I'll add a link to that
Oh, please do.
on
Yeah,
the YouTube version of this podcast. I'll definitely add a link.
that
Uh,
sounds great.
yeah, and of course, when I post this to the XM community as well.
Great.
And I guess just in our last minute or so, um, let's tackle the question of where data visualization is going from here.
Right.
What do you think the world of data viz will look like 10 years from now?
10 years from now. I think what happens is, as we see more visual communication, visual storytelling in journalism, it's going to become more widely used than some of the older forms of journalism that we tend to see. Like a lot of the distinction over the last 10 years has been between kind of short form listicles and things going on Twitter or other social media. And I think a point of frustration of a lot of analysts and journalists is, I don't have the time to do the journalism or the storytelling that I really want to do.
Yeah.
And one of the possibilities that I see happening is the visuals get deeper, and the tolerance of people for reading an article, say, about a particular topic versus, well, I'm going to read this short article, but I'm going to dive more deeply into the actual visuals. And I really wonder what would happen with, say, video journalism and things of that nature. I'm seeing a lot more of it on YouTube right now. And I wonder how kind of internal corporate discussion and research also changes related to that. And in a lot of ways, we're seeing it already, that
I agree.
um, 10 years ago, I might have been expected to write a memo about research that I've done.
Mhm.
Now, I may do a PowerPoint presentation, or I might even just share a workbook or share a dashboard with
Mhm.
somebody.
Right.
And I think that evolution will continue too. That as the, as we talked about earlier, the sort of limited appetite for a long presentation, that's probably going to continue. But as we get more familiarity with some of the tools that we're working with, I would hope that, at some point you might just bookmark a dashboard and see how that progresses daily or weekly or monthly. And certainly there will be space to do presentations, but those presentations would be less about a recitation of the data and more about, well, what should we do knowing what we know? And that could be a really good development.
Perfect. I think that's a great way to wrap up our conversation. I think there's so much more we could dive into, and perhaps we could schedule a second follow-up session on just the theme of artificial intelligence and how that's
Oh yeah, that's something we're thinking about
data
more and more.
visualization
Yeah,
in
in
the
so
future.
many ways too. Yeah.
Yeah, and in so many ways. Well,
Mhm.
I know we could keep talking for a long time, but Adam, I really appreciate your time. I know the community is going to find this podcast absolutely fascinating. Is it okay if community members contact you on the XM community
Absolutely.
to ask you
Yeah, please,
questions? Or okay, great.
please do. Yeah, I'd love to keep this conversation going. Whether it's the kind of AI thread that you talked about maybe
Yeah,
pulling up, or there's this is such a rich area,
yeah.
and I know it's still new to a lot of people in our community.
Mhm.
But I really do feel strongly about its value in kind of making sure that the things that we learn about our customers and stakeholders get through, because that's really why we're all here.
Exactly. Well, this podcast, like all of our others, will be available on Apple and Spotify, our XM Community YouTube channel, and then, of course, we'll post it directly on the community. And I will make sure to tag you, Adam, in the post and invite our fellow community members to comment with their thoughts on today's podcast.
That sounds terrific.
Thank you so much, Adam. It's always a pleasure talking to you. I always come away with new things that I did not know before. So it's always great to talk to you and learn from you. And
Oh,
thank you
likewise.
for participating in our podcast.
Great. Well, thanks so much for having me. It's been delightful, and I hope we get to do this again soon.
I hope so too.
All right.